G'day, welcome to yet another episode of the ADF Architecture TV series. My name's Chris Muir, I'm your friendly ADF product manager based in Australia. Now, this episode today is a continuation of the bonus episode from yesterday where we talked about designing for accessibility, building your ADF applications to make them more accessible to people with disabilities, making the user base that can actually use your application as wide as possible. Now, in that previous episode, what we looked at was the concepts of the definition of accessibility and also the need and importance of designing your applications for accessibility. What I'd like to address in today's episode is, what general support is available for accessibility in your applications, and then we're going to specifically talk about designing your applications for accessibility, what you need to think of. Now again, just remember this set of episodes, you must admit, is very short, a couple of 20-minute episodes, and therefore we're never going to give justice to the whole area of designing your applications for accessibility. But our main goal here is to give you a good taste of what you should do, what you should think about, and with all the great goal of helping out other people to use your applications. In addressing the concepts of designing your applications for accessibility and thinking about, okay, now an ADF application is a web application, and a web application runs in a browser. This should give you a little bit of an idea that before we even talk about accessibility support in ADF, Oracle's Application Development Framework, we should talk about the accessibility of, what support do browsers give you for accessibility? What features do they actually have themselves? So when you look at the different browsers by the different vendors, Internet Explorer from Microsoft, Chrome from Google, Safari from Apple, and so on and so forth, generally speaking, you will actually find they all already have inbuilt support for accessibility of one form or another. You'll know in most of the browsers you can do a zoom in, zoom out. You can increase the font sizes or decrease them. Some of the browsers support the idea of changing the colors for people with low vision, so you can switch to a monochrome display. And some of the browsers do also support accelerators or macros so that repetitive things can be sped up. In addition, you'll notice with the browsers there is quite a significant set of features to support keyboard interaction. And we did talk about in the previous episode that there are people out there who have motor impairments and they cannot use fine-grained controls like the mouse, so then they want to use the keyboard. So with that in mind, you can start to see with web applications, whether it's browsers or the applications that run in the browsers, the two main focuses of accessibility or people with impairments in terms of accessibility is that of visual and also motor impairments. Hearing, cognitive impairments, not such a priority for web applications. Most of the features aimed at people who are blind, have some sort of visual impairment, can't see, color blindness, or from a motor skill perspective, we're talking about providing them keyboard support over using over the mouse. Now, with the browsers in mind, it's great that they've got a number of features in them to support people with various impairments. And as you look across the new browser versions coming out, that accessibility support continues to increase. But when we have a web solution or a web framework such as that provided by Oracle's Application Development Framework, that framework in addition can take the support, the accessibility support, and extend it, make it more functional for our actual web users. So when with ADF, you may or may not know, you can actually turn it into an accessible mode called screen reader mode. And what you'll actually find, and we'll look at it in a little bit later in this episode, is a number of the Oracle ADF Faces components. When you switch them into this, let's say, accessible mode, they actually change the way they render and the way they behave in order to support people with various impairments. So out of the box, you as an ADF programmer, though, get this for free. Okay, from a component perspective, we do all of that work for you. It's just a matter of telling the application, hey, right now I'm working for somebody who has some sort of impairment, let's switch into accessible mode. In addition, behind the covers, we also do a lot of work to assist screen reading software like JAWS. We actually change the HTML and the markup that we generate to make the job of the JAWS screen reading software for blind people easy to work with. So if you've ever heard of JAWS, and there is a link here on the screen to the actual vendor and also a YouTube video where you can actually hear JAWS reading a website. So basically, a blind person, when you're using your website, uses one of these assistive technologies to literally read through the HTML structures on your screen and all the outputs so they can understand what's going on. So again, from the ADF componentry perspective, as long as we switch into that accessible mode, again, the programmer has to do nothing here, but from, say, the blind person's perspective who's using JAWS, well, an ADF application, in theory, should be more usable, should be more accessible to them. Alright, now let's consider actually designing your application for accessibility. Now you might remember in the previous episode we talked about if you make your application more accessible, by the nature of it you'll make it more usable. So in reality, doing both those things together, designing your application for accessibility and usability, you'll find that, hey, your application will be more accessible by its very nature, but also be very more usable by its very nature. But you do need to consider the needs, the specific needs of your clientele or your users, including the disabilities that potentially people will have. Okay, so you can't just go, okay, we'll make our applications usable, therefore they're accessible, and that takes care of everybody with all the different types of disabilities. Further to that, we also mentioned in the previous episode, don't just consider your external users or the general public if they're using your system, also consider your internal users or your actual staff members. They are as important as the outside group that maybe you're selling items to or goods and services to if you're a government department. And when considering designing your systems for accessibility, make sure you actually go through a process of designing for accessibility, i.e. your design documents and your screen mock-ups and so on and so forth actually have you thinking about, how is this more accessible? Then you're going to have to test it. We're just talking about JAWS, okay? JAWS is screen reading software. And one of the complications JAWS has is when you have a very long web page, it has to read through it all. So part of making a page for a blind person more accessible is, well, actually turning off your screen, turning on JAWS and letting JAWS read the page to you and seeing if it makes any sense. Now there's a whole bunch of guidelines out there on the internet about how to make things easier for screen readers, much beyond what I can tell you about here. But again, just put, I guess, yourself in the shoes of a blind person and test the application and see if it's usable. Finally, in order for you to actually show that your application is accessible, you need to document it. Okay? And you need to talk about what things you did to make the application accessible, because there's kind of two things you don't want to happen down the line. Number one, somebody comes around and says, why did they build it this way? This is a silly way to build it. We'll rearrange the screens and build it that way. If they have no documentation to say you built the screens in a particular way, they can quickly undo all your hard work. Another reason is just that of compliance. As we said in the previous episode, there's legislations and regulations around the world that says that you have to make your applications accessible. So by documenting your design for accessibility, you're basically documenting the fact that you've done that work. It's your due diligence. Moving beyond just the general idea of designing for accessibility, let's consider designing your application for accessibility using ADF. Now, as I already indicated in this episode, a lot of ADF components have additional accessible features, and they just come out of the box. All you need to turn on is the screen reader mode, or what I call the accessibility mode, and you get them all for free. But in saying that, just because ADF components do have accessible features, this does not make your application accessible. Like we talked about the JAWS example just then, even though the components might be able to be read by JAWS, if you have a very large, complex page that JAWS has to read through, that is not necessarily accessible to a blind person because it just has too much detail. Okay, so ADF has gone a long way here to help you. We've given you the right tools from Oracle ourselves, given you the right tools, but you then need to build the application the right way. So let's actually have a look at some of these accessibility mode features that the ADF components provide. Now what you can see here is the default accessibility mode defined in the Trinidad config file. And so when you have the accessibility mode set to default, basically the components, and in this example we've got a component, the components will render themselves for, well, a normal vision person. But if you then switch in the Trinidad config file the accessibility mode to screen reader, let's watch what happens. Now when the table renders, and without any programming changes on the developer's part, you see that we have different components and essentially different layout in the table component. To assist a blind person or somebody using a screen reader to move records, rather than relying on the mouse or say the mouse wheel, we provide them with pagination control. We also provide them a record selector. So again, now typically a sighted person would use the mouse to select a record, but we actually provide you a record selector which they can tab through with the keyboard to pick out a record or hit the little pencil button to select all the records. On the right hand side you can see that the filter control for the hire date has gone from having the normal calendar control which would pop up and again require sight to be able to use, and now it just replaces it with an icon which will tell the actual user here, the blind user, what format the date maskers are required in. And finally you'll notice that the headers, though it's a little unclear in this picture, but they're now all hyperlinks. So typically the header rows would be selectable with your mouse to sort them ascending and descending. Again, we're assuming a blind person can't use a mouse, so in this example we now provide hyperlinks in accessibility mode or screen reader mode such that the blind user can select those hyperlinks and switch the table for that particular column into ascending or descending mode. Now that's a little bit of a simplistic example. Let's take a more sophisticated example, and what we have here is the Oracle ADF Component Demo. Now let's actually switch this between the two accessibility modes and watch what happens. Now have a quick look at the screen at the moment, and now let's see where we go. So we're going to switch to a screen reader mode, and what do you notice? Okay, definitely a lot of changes here. The first thing you should notice is that the main graph in the middle has been replaced from an image to a table because obviously a blind person can't see the image. And talking about images, the branding Oracle logo has also disappeared and been replaced by text. Similar to previous where we saw the table control changed itself to include selection controls and pagination controls, here the tree control has done the same. And further to that, around the page, a number of the buttons have been replaced with hyperlinks with textual labels, which will be easier for JAWS to read and the blind user to make use of. Now, with all this in mind, there's I guess a valid argument that, well, why don't we just set accessibility mode on by default? Why not just make our whole application accessible by default? Turn on that ADF accessibility feature. Well, you need to understand in turning on the accessibility feature, not only are you changing the way that the components render, but you're also changing the HTML markup and the additional information that's needed for JAWS. So you will find that your pages will actually get larger. And given that the majority of the users don't have a disability, you're going to have a performance impact on them and the rest of the users because of a minority of users. So it becomes an interesting question then, doesn't it? Should you tune for performance or should you tune for accessibility? Well, the answer to this is you're going to want to strike a balance. One of the best ways to strike this balance is all your public facing pages, and they're accessible public facing pages before you actually have to authenticate, accessibility should be turned on in that case. Okay, so with those pages such as your landing page, your login page, turn your accessibility mode on, and that will allow all users to be able to access those pages. But once the user has logged in and registered themselves with your application, then they should be able to turn on and off screen reader mode, or what we call a little bit earlier on accessibility mode, in order to make the application suit their particular needs. So as you can see here, the rest of the application doesn't necessarily have to have accessibility mode on by default. Rather, once the user has established their credentials and their own preferences, then basically after that, we work out should we be actually rendering all the components in accessibility mode or not on their behalf. Now in doing that, not only do we need to store their credentials, that also means we need to store their user preferences. And that accessibility mode will be something that you'll have to store off in the MDS or your own database solutions. Okay, so accessibility, quite an interesting issue in many ways, because when you think about it, we really want to help all these people with disabilities and impairments, but we've got to remember as well, there is an impact on the rest of the users, so it's a balancing act, and that's usually how it is in computing. There's always a yin and a yang, you know, a three-sided triangle with different requirements pulling in different directions, and we need to find what the balancing act is for our application. Okay, so with all that in mind, and let's defocus on ADF specifically and now just talk about some design guidelines for creating pages that are more accessible. Let's give you a whole bunch of guidelines that you can take and run with right now. So the first design guideline is when designing your pages, create a clean design. Don't overload the pages with boxes and layouts, and as you see often in a dashboard situation, lots of portlets. The simpler you can make the design, the more accessible it's going to be. Next, when designing your pages in order to support your business processes, basically the task that the user is undertaking, that should be the single thing on the screen, and try to eliminate the rest of the detail around the screen if it's not important to what you're doing. So menus, structures, peripheral information, collapsed information that the user never looks at, again trying to eliminate all that unnecessary information. This will make the page more accessible because it's quite obvious on the page with the limited amount of information on it what you're meant to do. One of the things that JAWS and screen readers do is they often use headers in the page to allow a blind person to jump to certain sections within the page, so header 1s and header 2s. So in your page it is important to include these structures such that when the blind user is coming back again and again and again, they can with JAWS learn that those header structures are there and then instruct JAWS to skip over parts of your page. So this will allow them to navigate through the page and use it more effectively. And for peripheral parts on your page, or let's call them secondary functions, do not give these headers that say they are primary functions. Give them a very low-level sequence header, and JAWS or screen reader software will often allow the user to skip right over the top of those. Okay, so again, the blind user is basically navigating to the most important part of the page. Other things to remember? Well, people with low vision, wear glasses, can't see that well, or have colour blindness may not be able to see error messages in red or very small text. Another key point to remember, and it's a key feature of the ADF Faces framework, is that we have, well, the concept of partial page triggers, or PPR, where the user updates something on the screen and something else gets updated on the screen. Now you can appreciate for a blind user, they can't see that change. So if you kick off PPR events and there's a very important piece of information in the other field that they're meant to learn about, they're going to get stuck because they don't know that change has occurred. So some solutions to that particular case is use special headings where the blind user will navigate to see changes. Place the text near the top of the page where the blind user is more likely to navigate through more often than the rest of the page. Or use special page and pop-ups to highlight important information. So for the blind use case, they will actually get a pop-up that tells them, by the way, by changing this field, you've now got this updated value. It's also worth noting when discussing pop-ups, in accessibility mode, pop-ups are displayed in a separate window and the focus is automatically placed in that window. So you have a slightly different behavior than the normal application. In terms of things to avoid, flashing and blinking text. Now, we know on websites we shouldn't be doing that these days anyway. That was something we used to do when websites first came out. But obviously, while a blind person can't see the flashing text, and secondly, you can actually trigger epilepsy in some people. So this is something you definitely want to avoid. In addition, scrolling text like a ticker tape on the newsreels, again, something blind people can't see, and people with low vision, they're just not going to be able to see the details scrolling across the screen. Interestingly, drag and drop functionality, something that I guess Oracle and the ADF team promoted in our 11G release, with the idea that you can drag and drop components around the screen. Well, not something that's very useful to a blind person at all because they can't use a mouse to pick up the objects. So drag and drop functionality is one of those cool features, but in reality an accessible application isn't going to be able to make much use of it. You may, if you want to include drag and drop, you'll have to include two different screens, one for people who can use a mouse and see the screen and one that can't. You're necessarily going to have to change the way the page works in order to make sure that the person with a disability can still use your application. Now, in concluding this episode, it's worth making note that because Oracle itself is a software vendor that writes packaged applications that go into all sorts of organizations that have legislation and regulations on accessibility, we have copious amounts of guidelines on how to make applications accessible. On the screen here, you can see, even in our normal ADF documentation, numerous links to the accessibility features of ADF and what you should consider. Now, if you look around a lot of the external websites from Oracle Corporation, you will also find additional information on accessibility. And if you break outside the Oracle mold, a number of other vendors and I guess organizations, volunteer organizations are producing that information too. So in terms of saying that there's no information available to you, it's not really going to be a good enough excuse. Vendors, other organizations out there are really arming you to make sure that your applications are accessible and that you're supporting the needs of people with disabilities. So that concludes this bonus episode of the ADF Architecture TV series. This episode and the previous episode on designing for accessibility. We hope it's been useful to you, bringing some of the end episodes forward here so that you can make use of some of the skills and experiences and the points and guidelines we'd like to make to you. And beyond this episode, we'll be returning back to our regular schedule of releasing an ADF Architecture TV episode every week. So thanks for joining us on this, I guess, New Year's special for the ADF Architecture TV channel. It's our pleasure once again to have you with us, and we'll hope you will join us in the next episode very, very soon.